Good afternoon. You're in Baku, yeah?
Yes. I'm in Baku right now. Yeah.
Okay.
I assume you're in London, right?
Just outside London, yeah.
Just outside. All right. Hello, Mr. Lough, and quickly introduce myself. I'm Pasha Bayramov from the Social Research Center of Azerbaijan, and I am delighted to have you join us for this online discussion. And firstly, I'd like to introduce you to our audience today. We have the privilege of speaking with Mr. John Lough, a distinguished expert in geopolitical analysis with a profound understanding of international relations, particularly in the context of Russia, Eastern Europe, and beyond. So my first question will be about what are the potential long-term impacts of Russia-Ukraine war on European security architecture? And do you see the end for this conflict in near after the US elections?
Well, there are two very big questions there. Let's
Yeah.
start, first of all, with
Mhm.
the prospects for ending this war.
Mhm.
Clearly, President-elect Trump and his team are determined that they can find a way to bring this war to an end. And they believe they can do that by forcing both Russia and Ukraine into a negotiation. And I think the chances of starting some form of negotiation are probably quite good. Both sides, it seems to me, are tired and would like to find a way of ending the war, but of course, ending the war on their terms. And this is where the difficulty lies. So, to what extent it's going to be possible to make quick progress in this negotiation remains to be seen. But there is a possibility that neither side will feel it's time to compromise and that somehow this war will continue. Now, the levers that the Trump administration, incoming administrations, believes it has are the following. They can either stop supplying weapons to the Ukrainians on the one hand, if Ukraine is unwilling to stop fighting, and equally, if Russia wishes to continue the war and this displeases the US, then in theory they could give the Ukrainians a lot more weaponry. That's the kind of what they're playing with at a public level. But we will simply just have to see whether there is space for this type of negotiation that Washington wants both sides to have. And what it might then lead to. Could it lead to just a pause in the war, which is what, of course, the Ukrainian side fears, that this could be, in fact, a pause that just allows Russia to regroup and then possibly in a few years to come back and have another go at completely subjugating Ukraine. And the other question, of course, is what's going to happen with the security arrangements
Yes.
in the meantime? Are we going to see some sort of peacekeeping force put into Ukraine, possibly with European participation? I don't see the Americans being part of that. And then, finally, can we get to a situation where there is a durable peace arrangement that is broadly acceptable to both sides? And the experience of the ill-fated Minsk agreements from 2014, 2015 is not positive. And that was an example, I think, of a set of agreements that firstly were badly drafted. They largely reflected the situation at the time where Moscow had Russia had the upper hand. And it was an effort to impose certain terms on Ukraine by Moscow. In the end, it didn't work because it wasn't possible to implement badly
Yeah.
drafted agreements. So, there is some experience here that may be quite important. So there is, I mean, among experts, some debate at the moment about whether it will really be possible to get from, let's say, a ceasefire arrangement, then to, quickly to a
Yeah,
peace
exactly.
agreement, a broader agreement, or whether we will just be kind of stuck in this halfway house where we have a fragile ceasefire.
Mhm.
The the intensity of the war drops substantially. The US doesn't feel the need to give Ukraine much more. The European partners have to step up and provide a lot more practical assistance, both economic and military. And Ukraine sort of just kind of staggers through. But in that scenario, you can't attract the necessary investment to start rebuilding the country at scale. And it would be just a long, I think, sort of painful continuation of the war, but at a lower level, even though there might be a ceasefire. So is there a way of moving quickly to a broader peace agreement? And I think to do that, you'd have to have, some clear concessions on both sides. And the big issue out there is Ukraine's relationship with NATO, and whether it's going to be possible simply to kind of put that on ice.
Yeah.
And the US, we're hearing talk of maybe freezing it for 20 years. There's a broader question about what sort of NATO is going to exist in any case after 4 years of Trump 2.0. And I think that's actually very hard to say whether it is going to exist in a meaningful form. And if NATO is not the longer term route for securing Ukraine, then what is? And we don't have an adequate answer to that yet. So sorry for that very long sort of first answer.
It was okay. No worries about that. Yeah.
We
actually look for this kind of answers to look further into. So secondly, and I will move on to the second question. So I'd like to ask a question about your time. The root of my question is actually the time you spent in Moscow. So as NATO's first representative in Moscow, what were the key challenges you faced back in time? Because we researched about it, and some say Russia back in time really wanted to be part of NATO. And do you think by any chance it could have actually happened, or it was just a misconception by Russians that they might actually be part of NATO? Back in the day, of course.
Yeah, well, I was thinking, funny enough, Pasha, this morning that it's almost 30 years since I took up that position in Moscow, which is an amazing thought. And of course, it was a completely different era.
Exactly,
this was not long after the collapse of the
Soviet
Union. We had an administration in Moscow that was, I think, broadly speaking, very open to a relationship with the West. After all, the Western countries had supported Boris Yeltsin when he got on the tank in 1991. And so I don't think he personally, had that any feeling of hostility towards the West. He might not have liked, some ways in which he was treated later on, but he had a strong relationship with Bill Clinton, with Chancellor Kohl, and the atmospherics of this relationship were entirely different. And I remember that when I started work in Moscow in 1995, I was invited to a meeting at the Foreign Ministry. And the then head of the NATO section in the Russian Foreign Ministry said to me, "We need your help here in Russia to explain to the Russian public what NATO is. Please don't do this in any propagandistic way. Provide the facts and the basic knowledge, and we will support you." That was the message. I mean, it's quite an amazing thought looking back on it.
Yeah.
But we were, as that person saw it, we were very much on the same side, and we had a common interest. Now, I think with an understanding of history now, we can see that within the Yeltsin administration, there were some people who were very keen to build contacts with the West and to try to integrate Russia into the international system. And one thinks of the foreign minister Andrei Kozyrev at the time, who was seen as being very sort of pro-Western. I mean, I would have seen him as being pro-Russian, but understanding the need for a strong relationship with the West to secure this transition that Russia was making at the time. Now, those people were still, I think, in a minority. And as far as the sort of apparat was concerned, there was, still this very strong underlying suspicion towards the West, and I think particularly towards NATO. And this notion of the aggressivny bloc NATO
Exactly, yeah.
was very much ingrained. And you could see this also, of course, in the people we dealt with on the military side. But I would say there was a percentage of people there who were very open-minded, wanted to explore the possibilities for cooperation with NATO, with Western armies. And from what I observed at my time, when you put military people together from very different backgrounds, let's say Russians and Americans, or Russians and Brits, Russians and Germans, they find a common language because they are professionals and they have a strong degree of mutual respect. And we saw that very, very quickly, that it was possible to build these dialogues in different formats. The problem at the time was that the Russian military was in a very, very poor condition.
Yeah.
After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the lack of financing, lack of housing. You think of the way they withdrew, forces from Germany at very high speed.
Also, the Chechen War back in
then
time.
yes,
yeah.
the Chechen War,
It showed the
war
quality.
starting in 1994. So this was not a good time to open up and try to build the sort of relationship that NATO countries sought. And with the first discussions of NATO enlargement already underway, the atmosphere just became, I think, really very, very difficult. But on the positive side, we had some really excellent interaction with the Russian military in the former Yugoslavia. And this was around the implementation of the peace agreement in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where a Russian brigade was integrated into a NATO operation, NATO-led operation, their peacekeeping operation. And although the Russian brigade was technically under Russian command, effectively it was under NATO command. And that worked, as far as I recall, extremely well. The Russians sent very competent people to Belgium to be stationed at the NATO military headquarters at Shape in the south of Belgium. And of course, those sort of personal, links began to develop as people worked together. So this notion that Russia could have joined NATO, I mean, I think it felt, and President Putin echoed this at a later point.
Yes, exactly.
Russia didn't need to go through some sort of usual normal process for joining NATO. It wasn't going to apply. It needed to be asked to join NATO. And if Russia were to be a member of NATO, it would have had to have changed so many things in its. I mean, let's just say in its military system to begin with, to be compatible. It would have had to have learned, the art of sitting at the table with smaller countries, listening to their viewpoints, and coming to the consensus position. But I think it was just this notion that there could be some sort of condominium with the United States, and they could therefore work together in NATO, and joining NATO therefore made good sense. But the truth is that the way NATO has functioned from the outset is that it is a consensus among the member states. And there's this idea that or at least in Russia, that the Americans just tell their allies what to do, as the Soviet Union did in the Warsaw Pact. But from the outside, people don't. I mean, even in Western countries, I think sometimes don't just appreciate how intricate these different dialogues are between the member states, how they value this mechanism as a way of solving problems among themselves, and building this kind of long-term trust. And that's what Russia was being invited into the kind of NATO format to do. But it was through initially the Partnership for Peace, of which your your country was, also has also been a participant. Now,
Uh,
the Partnership for Peace, which was dreamt up by the Clinton administration,
yeah.
was intended to be a way to avoid the need, in fact, to enlarge NATO at the time. People kind of forget this. There was not some urgent, mission undertaken by the United States in 1991 to try to enlarge NATO. In fact, it was even within NATO itself, it was a really quite sensitive, controversial issue at the outset. But it became very clear, and and people forget history here, the issue of NATO enlargement was actually significantly driven by the Germans, who
Ah,
persuaded the Americans that it would be a good thing to have Poland and others in the alliance. These countries aspired to a higher level of security, and why would we want to deny them that? Particularly when we're in this world where we were not going to be at any point soon in any form of confrontation with Russia, because Russia was not in a condition to fight NATO, and it didn't seek a hostile relationship with the West at the time. So a lot has happened in the meantime, and Germany, as a result of Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary joining NATO at the
and
outset,
then
there,
Baltic states, like three
and
of them.
later the Baltic states.
Yeah.
But after that first enlargement, of course, it no longer felt it was on the front line, and that was important, I think, for the stability of Europe as a whole.
Mhm. Last question. It's okay if it's not your expertise, but I just want to ask if it's possible. I would like to hear from you. As a person from Azerbaijan, lastly, I would just like to ask you about Southern Caucasian region, especially. How do you see Azerbaijan's role in the geopolitical dynamics of the South Caucasus, especially given its relationship with neighboring countries like Turkey, Iran, and Russia? And what do you think are the key opportunities and challenges for Azerbaijan in positioning itself uh, as a regional leader in Southern Caucasus?
But clearly, your country is in a region where there's a lot moving at the moment,
Exactly.
and we can see a certain reduction of Russian influence. We can see the role of Turkey. Turkey has extraordinarily skillful diplomacy, maneuvering between these different poles and always trying to, I think, extract the benefits to promote its own interests, and it does that. In some ways remarkably successfully, it seems to me, and the latest events in Syria are an example of that. Now,
Is it?
the
Yeah.
geopolitics are influenced, of course, by the geoeconomics here, and the substantial energy resources that your country has, play a role in that. But what we're going through at the moment, and this doesn't just apply to the South Caucasus, it applies to the Europe, and in fact, I would say much of the globe at the moment, much of the world at the moment, is that we're seeing we are living through a revolutionary period of just upheaval in international affairs. And this is due to the internal processes in certain countries. We're witnessing the end of an era in terms of this, what we call the post-war settlement after 1945, and what we built onto that, the kind of post-Cold War settlement. Many of these things are now being redefined, and what we're seeing now, and I think the latest form of isolationism in
Is
the
it the end of the things, or is it just beginning of the change or
no,
that's
I
everything?
think it's the beginning of a new, a new era
Ah,
where some of the certainties of the past will no longer be present, and the sort of neo-isolationism of the United States is going to play a big role in that.
mhm.
And as a result, I think we're going to see, certain things happening in Europe that are long overdue as Europeans take greater responsibility for their for their defense. But I think Russia will have some difficult choices to make, and it will have some opportunities as well in this rapidly changing world. So things are very fluid at the moment. But I can, obviously see that your country wishes to play, an important role
Yeah.
in the South Caucasus. It has certain assets to do so,
Yeah,
but it
especially
also
after the war, yeah.
absolutely. But for the moment, we're going to live through I think, a very turbulent period. And this is not just the return of Donald Trump and his people. They are, if you like, they kind of symbolize this process that's taking place. And the consequences are going to be far-reaching, and it's very difficult for us in the expert community who are expected to be able to predict everything. We can't, because we just don't know how this sort of complex interaction of factors is going to play out.
Yes.
So it's a rather vague answer to a precise question.
Exactly.
I think at this stage I can't give you much more than that.
Yes,
But
it's
what I would say,
understandable.
the historical perspective, when I think back to the days when I started that job in Moscow, it was inconceivable that Russia and Ukraine would be engaged in a full-scale war. And there are many lessons to be learned, I think, about how this came about. And we need to study in particular how in future we could avoid this type of outcome. And how is it that a set of relationships can just change so quickly? Because 30 years in history is a very, very short period. And people's lives, it's maybe a significant time, but it's only 3 decades. And if you think back to the Budapest Memorandum that gave Ukraine certain security assurances for giving up its nuclear
Nuclear
weapons,
weapon, yeah.
it was able to accept those, and because there was no likelihood at the time of anything of this type happening. And there, I think we need to study what happened, how we got to that point where things just deteriorated so drastically.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lough. I really appreciate that you take your time to spend with us. And maybe in future we can see each other again. And after we publish this article, I will provide you with the links also.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. Thank you so much.
All right. Pasha, thank you very much.